Alright, my dudes. Today we're diving into something massive: the push for reform and the responses that followed throughout history. These movements shaped race, class, gender, and religion in ways that still affect us today. From the post classical era to the modern world, reform has been a constant force driving societies forward. So buckle up. This is OG History, and we've got a lot to cover.
Before the modern age, reform movements were already shaping societies. In the Islamic world, scholars in the House of Wisdom pushed for intellectual advancements, translating texts from Greek, Persian, and Indian scholars. These ideas spread across Europe, influencing the Renaissance centuries later. Meanwhile, in Christianity, reformers like John Wycliffe challenged corruption in the church, calling for changes in how religious authority was understood. Labor systems are also shifting. Peasants across Europe, tired of feudal oppression, revolted. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 saw thousands rise against unfair taxation and economic exploitation. The Black Death also played a role in reshaping labor dynamics, as the drastic population decline gave surviving workers more bargaining power. And let's not forget about the Mongols. They didn't just conquer, they also reshaped Eurasia, incorporating diverse religious and cultural influences into their empire. By tolerating different faiths and promoting trade, they laid the groundwork for a more interconnected world.
Now, let's fast forward. The Protestant Reformation in 1517, led by Martin Luther. Luther changed Christianity forever. He not only challenged the Catholic Church's authority, but arguing that salvation came through faith alone, and not indulgences. His 95 Theses, for example, sparked religious wars across Europe and led to the creation of Protestant churches. At the same time, new labor systems emerged, especially in the Americas. The transatlantic slave trade devastated African societies and built the economies of European colonies. But enslaved people, obviously, they would resist of this. In Brazil, Palmares was a community of escaped slaves who fought against Portuguese rule. Across the Caribbean and North America, revolts and rebellions made it clear that the enslaved will never stop fighting for their own freedom. Economic changes were also shaking things up. The rise of mercantilism encouraged European powers to control global trade, but this also increased economic inequality, as some European powers would gain access to global trade, but not as much as others would. The Enlightenment started pushing back against these inequalities. Thinkers like John Locke, who argued for natural rights, and Adam Smith, who criticized mercantilism, promoting free trade. These ideas planted the seeds for revolutions in the next era.
This is the era of revolutions. The American Revolution in 1776, the French Revolution in 1789, and the Haitian Revolution in 1791 all shared one thing: people fighting for their rights. In Haiti, enslaved people, led by Toussaint Louverture, overthrew the French colonizers, making it the first successful slave revolt in history. But it wasn't just political revolutions reshaping the world. Economic and social reforms were happening too. The Industrial Revolution transformed economies. Factories sprung up, but the working conditions were brutal. Whether it be child labor, long hours, or unsafe work conditions, all led for a push for workers' rights. Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, criticizing capitalism, calling for a classless society where workers had all power. Labor unions gained traction, organizing strikes and demanding fair wages, shorter workdays, and improved conditions. Governments were really slow to respond, but over time, reforms like factory laws and minimum wage policies started appearing. Women, too, demanded reform. Mary Wollstonecraft and other early feminists argued that women should have access to education and economic opportunities. This fight for gender equality gained momentum, and movements like the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 laid the foundation for future progress. Industrialization also created more opportunities for women to work outside the home, especially in textile factories. While conditions were tough, this shift helped fuel the demand for suffrage and legal rights. Abolition was also a major issue. Britain outlawed the slave trade in 1807 and slavery itself in 1833, while the U.S. fought a civil war over it. Formerly enslaved people like Frederick Douglass became leading voices in the movement, proving that the fight for justice was far from over. Resistance to abolition was strong, especially from plantation owners who depended on enslaved labor. But abolitionists continued their fight through speeches, literature, and even direct action like the Underground Railroad. Meanwhile, reforms weren't just happening in Europe and the Americas. In China, the Taiping Rebellion, 1850 to 1864, was both a religious and social movement, challenging Qing rule and calling for radical changes, including land redistribution and gender equality. In Russia, serfdom was abolished in 1861 by Tsar Alexander II, a move that mirrored growing global shifts towards labor reform. These events showed that the call for change was a worldwide phenomenon, not just limiting to Western nations.
Alright, so people weren't just fighting for social equality, they were also fighting for environmental and economic justice. Enter Greenpeace. One of the biggest names in environmental activism. They took on pollution, climate change, and deforestation, demanding corporations and governments step up. And speaking of trees, shout out to Wangari Maathai and her Greenbelt movements in Kenya. She organized women to plant millions of trees, restoring forests and empowering communities. Not only was it great for the environment, but it helped give women economic independence.
Now let's talk about fair trade. Globalization led to mass production, which sounds great, until you realize a lot of workers were being exploited in sweatshops. Enter the World Fair Trade Organization. Their goal? Make sure workers get fair wages and safe conditions. Today, fair trade practices are becoming more common, but there's still a long way to go.
And this isn't just a historical thing. These fights are still happening. People are protesting corporate greed, climate inaction, and worker exploitation. Social media, for example, has made activism more global than ever. Whenever it's climate strikes, wage protests, or campaign for racial justice, this struggle is far from over.
Even with all these victories, problems still exist. The gender pay gap is still a thing. Systemic racism, still an issue. And environmental destruction, getting worse. But history has shown us that change is possible when people fight for it.
So what's the takeaway here? Reform doesn't just happen. It's pushed forward by people who refuse to accept inequality. The battles of the past paved the way for progress today, and it's up to us to keep that momentum going. And now for the Q&A segment. Question 1. How did the UN Declaration of Human Rights impact global policies? Let me give you a quick little second for that. Okay. It set the foundation for international human rights laws influencing treaties and domestic policies worldwide.
Question 2. Why was the Civil Rights Act of 1965 significant? It ended segregation and protected voting rights. This paved the way for greater racial equality in the U.S.
Question 3. What role did the Greenbelt movement play in environmental activism? It empowered local communities, especially women, to fight deforestation and climate change through grassroots activism.
Question 4. How has globalization influenced labor rights? While globalization created jobs, it also led to worker exploitation. Fair trade movements help combat this by ensuring ethical labor practices.
Thank you for watching. This is OG History.